I learned early that in my family, quiet service was treated as proof I had no value, and the day my grandmother died, my uncle made that verdict public before the flowers had wilted. My name is Natalie Brooks, and that was the night they mistook composure for weakness one final time. The probate conference room on the 12th floor of the County Justice Centre was built to flatter authority, veined marble under recessed light, polished brass nameplates aligned with geometric precision, glass walls that turned everyone inside into an exhibit. Even the air felt curated, cold with recycled ventilation and the faint scent of expensive cologne layered over courthouse coffee. At the far end of the table, where the lead trustee should have sat with deliberative gravity, Uncle Dean leaned back in his chair like a man already counting rooms in a house he did not yet own. He did not lower his voice. He wanted the clerk, counsel, my cousins and the assistant from the trust office to hear him when he said, "You'll never see a penny of her estate. Loyalty in this family was earned, not begged." No one gasped. That detail mattered more than the insult. The room did not protest because the room had been trained for years to accept Dean's version of truth, that he was stewardship, that I was sentiment, that his volume was leadership and my restraint was deficiency. I had watched that training happen in increments so small they felt harmless at first. My father's funeral reception had barely ended when Dean began introducing me as our fragile Natalie. The phrase polished into a smile so smooth, most people missed its blade. At foundation board lunches, he would place his hand lightly at my elbow, turn me half a step away from donors, and continue talking as if I had asked to leave. If someone asked where I worked, he would answer for me before I opened my mouth. "She helps with family matters," he would say, and conversation moved on, credentials erased with courtesy. In a family that worshipped the appearance of order, erasure done politely still counted as erasure. The clerk to my right, Ms. Liao, slid a legal pad toward me as if reminding both of us that a record was still being made. Her pen tapped once against the margin, an unobtrusive rhythm of procedure. I straightened the pad, aligned it with the edge of the table, and acknowledged her with a nod. Then I looked at Dean and said, with an even tone I had practiced for years in rooms where men mistook calm for concession, "I understand your position." It was the only line I gave him. He smiled in the way men smile when they think they have won by making a woman defend her right to occupy a chair. He wanted outrage. He wanted me to stand, to point, to cry, to offer him a spectacle he could describe later as instability. Instead, he got posture, breath control, and silence, measured to the cadence of a court reporter's hands. Across from me, my cousin Rebecca folded her arms and angled her body toward Dean, not me. Her husband stared at his phone and pretended to read. The associate from Dean's firm whispered something to the junior trustee, and they both glanced at me with the detached pity people reserve for someone they believe has already lost. I could read hierarchy the way some people read weather: who received eye contact first, whose documents were copied without request, whose coffee arrived before the meeting started, whose name was spoken with title, and whose was spoken without one. In that room, every cue said the same thing. Dean belonged at the centre, and I had been invited to witness my own exclusion in respectable language. I kept my hands still on the table. The urge to reach into my tote and place the sealed steel blue binder between us arrived like a muscle memory, immediate and almost physical. It rested against my knee, heavier than paper should have been, closed with my grandmother Evelyn's wax insignia, the old crest she pressed into correspondence she considered binding in spirit, even before it became binding in law. Beside it sat the fountain pen Dean had mocked at Christmas as sentimental clutter, the one with the silver engraving worn smooth where my grandmother's thumb had held it for years. He had laughed when she asked me to keep it in safe custody after her second hospitalization. "If she leaves anything in that house," he said then, "it will be antiques and obligations." I had smiled and placed the pen in its case because by that point I understood that people who performed certainty in public often neglected details in private. 3 days before the hearing, I had stood in my grandmother's pantry at dusk with a cardboard file box on the tile floor, inventory tabs spread beside me, and grief so controlled it felt mechanical. Her mug still sat upside down on a drying mat. Her medication chart was on the refrigerator in my handwriting, each dosage logged, each refill date marked. I had not cried then either. I had indexed. After my father died, organisation became the language I used when language itself failed me. Other people shouted their loyalty at holidays and took photographs for proof. I learned to show up on Tuesdays when no one else arrived, to answer pharmacy calls, to argue over insurance denials, to sit through discharge instructions and ask the second question after everyone else accepted the first answer. Service without witnesses becomes habit. Habit becomes character. Character in families like mine is frequently exploited before it is respected. Dean was still speaking. Still, he had shifted from prophecy to policy as if he were lecturing a board he chaired. The trust is explicit, he said, one hand open over the draft agenda. There is a loyalty clause. There are consequences for disloyal behaviour. We are not here to indulge revisionist emotion. He loved the word we. It made commandeering sound consensual. The trustee beside him, a man who had met my grandmother twice in 6 years, nodded as if passing doctrine. My jaw tightened once and released. I wrote the date at the top of my pad, then the time, then one line in block capitals. Statements made prior to formal reading. Beneath it, I wrote his sentence exactly as spoken, including the pause before begged. I had spent enough of my career in fiduciary risk and military-adjacent compliance review to know that memory is fragile, but contemporaneous notes can outlive charisma. Through the glass wall, I could see the corridor outside, where families waited on benches under framed portraits of former judges, each face painted with the same austere confidence. A maintenance worker buffed the hallway floor with a machine that hummed like distant aircraft. That sound pulled me briefly to another room years earlier. Fluorescent lights, conference table, men twice my age debating control failures in a procurement channel, one of them saying, "Can someone senior translate her findings?" while I sat beside a slide deck with my name on every page. I had watched the same play in different institutions. Diminish first, discredit second, then call your own aggression objectivity. That day, after 2 hours, the colonel in charge asked who had authored the corrective matrix. When he heard my answer, he made everyone restart from slide 1 and address their questions to me directly. Respect did not arrive as apology. It arrived as procedural realignment. I learned to prefer that form. It scales better. Back in probate, Ms. Liao cleared her throat and requested signatures confirming attendance. Dean signed first and pushed the sheet down the table without looking at me. Small choreography, same message. I signed where indicated, printing my name in full. Natalie Evelyn Brooks. I kept my grandmother's first name as my middle name because she told me once, when I was 19 and too proud to admit I needed comfort, that lineage was not a chain unless you let unworthy people hold the other end. Keep what is clean, she said. Return what is not. At the time, I thought she meant heirlooms. Years later, I understood she meant narratives. Dean angled toward counsel. For efficiency, he said, we should note at the outset that Natalie will not be participating in trustee deliberations today. He did not ask. He announced, his attorney, Mr. Halpern adjusted his cuff and replied, "That would be consistent with our preliminary interpretation, pending judicial confirmation." Pending judicial confirmation. The phrase sat in the room like a warning bell no one but me seemed to hear. They were already speaking as if exclusion were administrative housekeeping, not contested law. I wrote another note. Attempted preemptive limitation of participation before clause construction. My pulse stayed steady. My breathing stayed even. Restraint was not passivity, it was sequencing. When the clerk called for a short adjournment before transfer to the emergency calendar, people rose in clusters that mirrored alliances. Dean moved toward the window with Rebecca and Halpern, all three of them leaning in, voices low and efficient. I stayed seated, opened my tote halfway, and touched the edge of the steel blue binder without removing it. Wax insignia intact. Seal unbroken. Chain of custody cards still clipped where I had placed it. The engraved pen rested in its slot, weight balanced, metal cool. No one looking at me would have guessed what it held, and that was the point. Public rooms reward spectacle until they are forced to respect evidence. Dean thought loyalty was a family myth he could narrate into existence. My grandmother had drafted it as a legal standard with measurable conduct, defined under pressure, attached to consequences that did not bend for volume. I closed the bag, squared my shoulders, and stood when the bailiff opened the door to call us upstairs. I didn't need the room to like me. I needed the record to hold. The bailiff led us through a narrower corridor where the marble gave way to older stone, the walls patched with paint the colour of paper left in sun. Courtroom 12E sat at the end beneath a brass placard that had been polished so often its edges were soft. Inside, the emergency calendar was already in motion, a landlord matter at council table, 2 clerks passing files with practiced speed, the judge on the bench reviewing a stipulation without looking up. The room carried that familiar courthouse blend of toner heat, wool coats drying from morning rain, and old wood sealed under too many coats of varnish. Dean paused before entering and touched Halpin's sleeve, a private signal meant to look accidental. Then he stepped in first. Seating became the first contest and the first public lesson in hierarchy. The primary petitioner table had 3 chairs. Dean took the centre chair, Halpin took the right, and Dean's co-trustee representative slid into the left before I reached the rail. When I stopped, file in hand, Halpin turned with a sympathetic expression I had seen on men delivering exclusion, as if it were customer service. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, but not quietly enough, "there is overflow seating behind the bar. We'll call you if testimony requires it." Dean did not face me when he added, "This is a governance hearing, Natalie, not a family discussion." A few junior associates at the back glanced up, then back down, learning the script from the people billed highest. I could have named 3 procedural grounds on the spot and demanded a ruling before anyone sat fully. I could have said lead petitioner, noticed appearance, contested trustee status, due process. I could have forced immediate embarrassment and probably won that narrow point. Instead, I set my tote on the empty side shelf by the clerk's station, approached Ms. Liao and said, "Please mark my appearance as present and prepared to proceed on petitioner's emergency motion." She nodded once, entered it, and slid me a standing lectern at the end of council row. Standing instead of seated was supposed to read as diminishment. I treated it as geometry. From that angle I could see the bench, the witness stand, and every face that mattered. By the time the prior case concluded, the gallery had filled with people who had business in trust and probate, lawyers waiting on their own calls, paralegals with clipboards, 2 relatives from another family dispute, and a pair of law students assigned to observe emergency practice. Public enough to reward performance, formal enough that performance could still be punished by transcript. Dean understood that ecosystem. He had built half his reputation in rooms like this by speaking certainty first and checking statutes second. When our matter was called, Halpin rose before the clerk finished the case number. "Your Honour, we appear on an urgent administrative clarification," he began. "Given active grief dynamics and heightened emotional involvement by one beneficiary, we request interim enforcement of the loyalty clause to preserve estate order pending full construction. Emotional involvement by one beneficiary." He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the judge, then at the gallery, allowing the phrase to travel. Dean kept his expression composed, sorrowful even, as if he regretted necessity. "My niece has had a difficult season," he said when invited to speak. "We all have. We are simply asking the court to prevent disruption. She is procedurally unqualified to manage trust administration at this level." The words landed in the room with the dull force of familiar prejudice dressed as governance. A junior partner in the back row whispered to another, not quite under breath, "So she's not counsel and not trustee. Why is she up there?" The other answered, "Family leverage, maybe." They wrote something down as though I were a cautionary footnote. I placed both hands lightly on the lectern and waited for acknowledgement. The judge, a compact woman with reading glasses perched low, turned toward me. "State your name for the record." "Natalie Evelyn Brooks," I said. "Petitioner. Not represented at this stage." My voice sounded steadier than my ribs felt. "Response to the interim request?" she asked. Halpin shifted as if expecting me to overreach. Dean kept his eyes on the bench, chin tilted in patient authority. "My response is narrow," I said. "No interim enforcement should issue before clause construction, because the trust instrument defines loyalty by specified conduct, and the record before this court is incomplete without authenticated exhibits already lodged with the clerk under seal." I did not raise volume. I did not mention the years, I did not mention nights in hospital corridors or the medication chart on Evelyn's refrigerator. I gave the judge the architecture, not the ache. I request that all parties be ordered to preserve communications and that no discretionary distributions proceed until the trust protector appears. The judge wrote 2 lines, then asked Halpern if he contested the existence of sealed exhibits. He said he had not reviewed them yet and objected to any implication of wrongdoing. Of course he did. 27 minutes into the hearing, the humiliation became overt enough that even the clerk paused typing. Halpern moved to strike part of my statement and said, "Ms. Brooks is presenting herself as a technical expert in fiduciary risk. Our position is that she lacks standing to characterize trust controls and should be treated as a grieving relative, not an operational authority." Dean added, almost gently, "She has always been sensitive. We are trying to keep this respectful." The gallery shifted. Someone coughed. One of the law students looked directly at me, then quickly away when I met her eyes. Respectful, sensitive, grieving relative. Each word chosen to reduce capacity without sounding cruel. Each word delivered where witnesses could convert it into reputation by noon. Heat climbed my neck, then settled behind my sternum. A tight, bright pressure I had known since childhood dinners when adults narrated my life across the table, while I sat there with a full vocabulary and no permission to use it. My first impulse was old and sharp. List my credentials, cite every review panel, name the military-adjacent compliance audits where my matrices became policy after men called them excessive. The second impulse was newer and stronger. Do not litigate identity when instrument language can do the work cleaner. I inhaled once through my nose, exhaled slowly, and turned one page on my pad so deliberately that the paper sound cut through the room. Then I said, "Your Honour, I oppose characterization arguments and request focus on documentary criteria in Section 4.2 and Section 7.1 of the instrument, including the conduct definitions attached in Appendix C." The judge regarded me for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Granted as to focus," she said. "Counsel, keep argument to operative language." A small ruling, but the axis shifted by degrees. Halpern nodded with visible restraint and pivoted to text. Dean leaned toward him, whispering, then sat back when the judge looked over her glasses. Miss Liao handed up my preliminary exhibit list. I watched Dean read the first page and dismiss it with a tiny shake of his head, the way he used to dismiss my comments at foundation meetings by tapping his watch and moving to the next agenda line. He believed the room still belonged to him because he could still hear his own cadence. 3 days earlier, when I assembled the appendix crosswalk at my kitchen table, midnight had already passed and rain had started against the windows in narrow diagonal lines. I remember that detail because fatigue had made my hands clumsy, and I had paused to rest my forehead against the cool glass before returning to the file. The loyalty clause looked broad when quoted in isolation, exactly the way Dean quoted it in public. But the definitions that governed enforcement lived elsewhere, buried in annex directives and amendment notes that only mattered if someone read beyond page 1. Sustained duty under pressure, documented adherence to approved care protocols, non-interference with medical access. It was all there, drafted in Evelyn's exacting style, each term tighter than the speeches made in her name. Back at the lectern, I requested leave to address one logistical point. "Given competing claims over trustee communication channels," I said, "I ask that all future estate notices route through the court portal and trust protector until this matter is resolved." Halpern objected immediately. Dean followed with rehearsed concern. "That would paralyze routine administration," he said, "and it sends a damaging signal to institutions we work with." There it was again. Audience perception elevated above instrument fidelity. I answered without turning toward him. A neutral channel protects all parties from allegations of selective notice. It is a standard containment measure. The judge asked one question about timing, then granted temporary neutral routing through the clerk and protector's office. Dean's jaw moved once, as if he were resetting his bite. The next attempt to sideline me came from my own side of the aisle, and that was the part that stung in a new way. A young attorney from the provisional trustees firm, a woman I had never met, leaned over and whispered, "If you keep speaking directly, you risk irritating the bench. Let counsel handle this." She meant it as professional advice. She also meant that I did not look like authority to her unless authority wore a bar card and sat in the centre chair. I met her gaze and said softly, "I appreciate the concern. I am speaking on noticed factual matters." She blinked, then nodded, uncertain whether she had been corrected or thanked. In rooms built on credential sorting, people often become instruments of diminishment without malice, just habit. By early afternoon, the hearing had narrowed to scheduling, preservation, and threshold interpretation. The judge set an accelerated evidentiary session for the next morning and ordered the trust protector to appear in person. She denied interim disinheritance enforcement and directed all parties to refrain from contact with medical facilities except through authorized channels. Dean asked for immediate reconsideration in a tone that implied the order was an inconvenience rather than a command. Denied. Halpern requested that my sealed materials remain inaccessible pending authenticity review, granted in part with chain of custody verification at opening. When the clerk read each ruling into the record, the room's energy flattened into that bureaucratic stillness that follows a power bid, failing in plain sight, but not yet fully collapsing. As people stood, Dean gathered his papers with controlled precision and finally looked at me directly. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear. The old script invited apology, retreat, maybe tears in a hallway where his version could spread faster than mine. I placed my pen in its slot, closed my legal pad, and answered, "No, I am making it accurate." He held my gaze for 2 seconds, then turned away to catch Halpern before he reached the door. I stayed until Miss Liao finished stamping the minute order because stamped paper survives mood. At the side shelf, I checked the wax seal on the steel blue binder again, then signed the temporary evidence transfer form for overnight court custody. Physical evidence logged, storage confirmed, receipt number recorded in my notebook beside the time. Procedure first, always. Outside the courtroom windows, the sky had gone the colour of hammered steel, and rain traced thin lines down the glass that distorted the courthouse lights into wavering bars. I watched Dean cross the corridor with his cluster intact, still speaking, still curating the story for anyone willing to carry it. I felt the pressure in my chest ease by one measured degree. He had his voice. I had the record, the schedule, and a judge who had ordered the right witness into the room. Silence was not surrender. Silence was sequencing, and mine was nearly complete. I was still facing the rain-streaked glass when Ms. Liao came to stand beside me with the minute order in a manila sleeve, the paper warm from the printer and stamped in violet ink that bled slightly into the fibres. "Certified copy tonight or tomorrow morning?" she asked. Her voice was neutral, the kind that had learned to survive other people's emergencies by refusing their drama. I asked for tonight. She gave a brief nod and told me records would close in 30 minutes, then added, after a pause that sounded almost human in a building built for procedure, "You did well to stay on the language." I thanked her, signed one more acknowledgement line, and took the elevator down to records with my tote strap cut into my shoulder and my jaw still carrying the shape of restraint. The records corridor had low fluorescent light and wax tile that reflected shoes in fractured strips. 2 families waited outside the certification window, one arguing in whispers over property keys, one sitting in exhausted silence around a stroller packed with grocery bags instead of a child. I stood at the end of the line and listened to the clerk behind the glass call case numbers with the same cadence every time, as if repetition could civilize grief. Through the open transom, Dean's laugh carried from the cross-hall conference alcove, controlled and resonant, followed by Halpern's lower murmur and a third voice's clipped agreement. He was already drafting his public version. Temporary setback, technical delay, niece in over her head. He had done that my entire adult life, and for years I mistook my refusal to counter-narrate for moral high ground when it was partly fear that no one would believe me before they believed him. By the second winter after my father died, Dean had turned invalidation into family policy without ever naming it that way. At foundation events, he introduced Rebecca with titles and committees, and me with weather. "Natalie made it through the traffic," he would say, smiling at donors while his hand hovered near my elbow, ready to steer me out of frame. At one annual gala, a retired colonel asked what division I worked in after seeing the insignia pin on my lapel from a compliance deployment overseas. I opened my mouth to answer, and Dean spoke across me. "She helps with elder logistics," he said. "Our Natalie keeps everyone organised." The colonel nodded politely and pivoted back to Dean because rooms follow whoever appears most certain. I stood beneath a chandelier that threw light like fractured ice and felt myself converted into administrative scenery in one sentence. That same spring, the Foundation's General Counsel sent board packets to Dean Brooks and family and omitted my risk memorandum from the attachment index. I discovered it because I stayed late to stack chairs after a donor briefing and saw my report, still clipped, in the shred bin beside the copier. Not rejected, not debated, simply excluded from Agenda Oxygen. When I asked Dean the next morning, he said, "You are talented, Natalie, but these discussions require political timing." Political timing became his phrase for any moment when my competence threatened his arrangement. I learned the contour of that arrangement by repetition. If I produced analysis, he called it anxiety. If I asked for process, he called it personal. If I stayed quiet, he called it proof I had nothing to add. Silence was never interpreted as discipline when he controlled the translation. The line moved. I slid my request form under the glass and watched the records clerk stamp it without looking at my face. At the far wall, a framed photograph showed the courthouse ribbon cutting from 2 decades earlier, men in dark suits gripping ceremonial scissors, one woman at the edge cropped at the shoulder by the mat. Institutional memory had always been edited this way, not by conspiracy but by habit. While the printer chattered behind the window, my phone vibrated with an unknown number from the hospital exchange. I stepped aside to answer. The Ombudsman's assistant identified herself, confirmed receipt of the court's non-contact directive, and said the Ombudsman would appear in the morning with certified visitor access logs from both of my grandmother's admissions. "We have preserved the original metadata and sign-in scans," she said. "No alterations." I asked her to route copies through the Clark portal and repeated the receipt number. Outcome logged. Contact resolved. When I hung up, I remembered the first time Dean tried to reframe my grandmother's care as my emotional hobby instead of documented labour. Evelyn was in step-down recovery after a cardiac episode, and the nurse station had changed shift twice while I sat in the corner chair annotating medication interactions from the discharge sheet. Dean arrived in a navy overcoat, glanced at the clipboard in my lap, and said, in front of 2 staff members, "You can go home, Natalie. We have professionals now." I answered that I was cross-checking contraindications because one dosage had already been entered incorrectly. He laughed softly and told the nurse, "She worries for sport." 20 minutes later, the attending thanked me for catching the duplication before administration. Dean never apologised. On the drive back, he spoke about parking rates and never referenced the near miss. In his framework, accuracy counted only if he could narrate it as his own prudence. 3 days passed after that admission before he attempted to revise the approved visitor list, substituting his office line for my number in the emergency contact field and marking one of Evelyn's longtime neighbours as non-family optional. The charge nurse called me because my authorisation was still on file under continuity directives. I drove in from a compliance briefing across town, arrived with my credentials and power of care addendum, and watched the supervisor restore the original list while Dean stood at the counter insisting he was simplifying communications. Simplifying was another one of his terms. It always meant narrowing access until only his version remained. The clerk called my name and passed the certified order through the slot. I checked the seal, folded the copy into my folio, and stepped back into the corridor where courthouse traffic had thinned to custodial carts and late attorneys, hurrying toward elevators with jackets over their arms. Rain struck the high windows in a steady metallic rhythm. I took the stairs back to the evidence intake office because the elevator had stalled twice already, and I didn't want one more delay between intention and documentation. At intake, a grey-haired evidence technician named Mr. Kessler was balancing chain tags at a stainless counter under bright task lamps. I gave him my receipt number for the steel blue binder and requested verification of seal condition before morning call. He retrieved the case bin, scanned the barcode, and set the binder on a felt pad with a care that belonged more to museums than courts. Under the lamp, Evelyn's wax insignia looked darker than it had in my kitchen, almost garnet against steel blue linen. The seam tape remained unbroken. The chain card carried my signature, Miss Liao's initial, and Kessler's intake mark with time down to the minute. He read the description aloud for confirmation. 1 trust binder, sealed. 1 engraved fountain pen in fitted case, listed as associated container. Contents not accessed pending bench order. I confirmed each point. He asked whether I sought pre-hearing inspection of exterior items only. I said yes, Limited to the pen case for identity verification, no extraction, all on camera. Kessler angled the evidence camera, stated the date and case number, and opened the outer tote sleeve where the pen case had been stored separately under the same transfer authority. The leather was worn at the hinge. Silver letters along the barrel caught the light when he lifted the lid. EB. The engraving rubbed smooth where Evelyn's hand had rested for years. Dean had called it sentimental clutter because he had never looked closely enough to see the narrow seam below the cap ring, the one detail that distinguished this pen from every other heirloom in her desk drawer. I had noticed it a month before she died when she asked me to bring her writing case to the rehabilitation wing and then dismissed the nurse so we could speak alone. She was tired that afternoon, voice thin from oxygen flow, but her diction was exact. People who perform loyalty often fear records, she said, fingers resting on the blanket in deliberate stillness. If there is dispute, give process the better memory. Then she asked for the pen, unscrewed the barrel with 2 practice turns and revealed the micro USB insert nested in a custom sleeve inside the chamber. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just precise engineering from a woman who trusted documentation more than declarations. This is not for argument, she told me. It is for threshold proof when someone says devotion and means control. I asked what was on it. Directive drafts, care logs, communications with counsel, and 1 memorandum in my own voice defining the clause in plain terms. Chain of custody must be clean. She made me repeat that instruction before she handed it back. At intake, with the camera recording, Kessler did not open the barrel because we had no extraction order. He photographed the engraved initials, the manufacturer mark, and the seam indicator visible near the cap threads, then returned it to the case and resealed the evidence pouch. Condition documented, he said. No breach. I signed the supplemental verification form and asked him to add 1 note. Associated Digital Media expected inside pen barrel pending court authorization. He typed the language exactly and rotated the monitor for my review before finalizing. Physical evidence logged, storage reconfirmed, descriptive limitation explicit. No room for improvisation later. When I stepped out of intake, the courthouse clock above the security desk showed 7:18 p.m. The lobby had emptied to a few stragglers and 1 deputy reviewing transport paperwork beneath a bank of muted televisions. I called my office voicemail to leave myself a contemporaneous summary, a habit from years in compliance work where memory had to be captured before sleep edited it. Date, time, actions taken, forms signed, contacts received, pending appearance of trust protector and ombudsman. I kept it factual and brief. Then I walked to the revolving doors and into cold rain that smelled of wet stone and bus exhaust, the city lights flattening into long gold smears across the pavement. At home, I hung my coat over a chair, set the certified order beside my keyboard, and opened the backup archive I had prepared from non-privileged care records months earlier in case Dean attempted exactly what he attempted today. The files were organised by date and source, pharmacy confirmations, nurse callback logs, approved visitor reports, discharge corrections. On top sat Evelyn's handwritten card from the rehab afternoon, scanned in high resolution with her instruction underlined twice. Let the right room hear it. I read it once, then closed the folder and turned to drafting my morning outline in narrow sections the judge could follow without narrative excess. Section 4.2, Language. Appendix C definitions. Chain of custody chronology. Requested remedy tied to instrument text and fiduciary duty, not family grievance. By midnight, the rain had eased to a soft ticking at the windows, and my shoulders finally unclenched enough for breath to reach all the way down. Just before I shut the laptop, I received an automated portal notice that Halpern had filed a late memorandum arguing the loyalty clause was aspirational and therefore unenforceable as to trustee discretion. He had attached 3 excerpts stripped from their definitions and omitted the amendment cross-reference where Evelyn anchored enforcement to measurable conduct. The filing was technically neat and structurally hollow. I drafted a 2-page response, cited the omitted sections, and uploaded it with service confirmation to all parties, including Dean's office and the Trust Protector's docket address. External filing made, outcome timestamped. No calls, no speeches, just record. By 6:40 the next morning, the courthouse plaza was still slick with overnight rain, and the brass railings at the entrance held the first thin light like a blade. I stood beneath the awning with my folio against my ribs, watched court staff badge through side doors and felt the old pressure return in measured waves that no longer frightened me because I knew what it was. The body remembering years of being reduced in public and preparing at last to answer with proof. I entered when security opened lane 2, signed the evidence access register for hearing day, and walked toward 12E before the corridor filled, carrying nothing theatrical, nothing speculative, only the documents my grandmother trusted to outlast whoever spoke the loudest. I entered the corridor outside 12E while the cleaning crew was still finishing the opposite wing, their cartwheels clicking over tile seams like a metronome for nerves. The courtroom doors were open, but the well was only half lit. Bench lamps on, gallery dim, counsel tables still carrying yesterday's abandoned water rings. Dean was already there with Halpin and 2 new associates I had not seen before, all of them standing around the primary table with folders fanned in neat stacks as if they had held the room overnight and expected gratitude for maintaining order. A white tent card sat in the centre position. Co-trustee representative. The card in the left chair read, Counsel. The third chair, the one left open for petitioners in contested probate hearings, had no card at all. On the side rail near the gallery, a single placard had been set out, Beneficiary Observer. Halpin noticed me first. He gave me the same courteous expression he used when asking clerks for extensions he had not earned. Good morning, Ms. Brooks. We took the liberty of organising seating to streamline argument. He turned slightly and indicated the Observer placard with 2 fingers, as if offering me preferred theatre tickets. Dean kept his attention on the file in front of him and said, without looking up, We are trying to reduce confusion today. The slight was minor on paper and devastating in context. Seating decides who is presumed to speak. Speaking decides who is presumed to matter. I walked past the Observer placard, set my folio on the edge of the petitioner table where no card had been placed, and asked Ms. Liao, who had just come through the clerk's side door with a stack of minute sheets, Would you verify my status on the call? She checked the docket terminal, then said clearly enough for counsel and gallery to hear, Petitioner appearing pro se on noticed factual and instrument matters pending protector review. She took the blank tent card from the side shelf, wrote Petitioner in dark block letters, and set it in the empty centre chair. Dean gave a soft exhale through his nose, the sound of a man watching a script refuse to hold. Natalie, he said, tone pitched to seem patient before an audience that had barely arrived. You are making ordinary logistics adversarial. I removed my coat, hung it on the chair back, and answered him without heat. I am making the caption accurate. Ms. Liao returned to her station, and the first 2 observers from the 9 o'clock calendar drifted in, saw the placement, and adjusted their assumptions in silence. By 8:52, the room had filled to the rail. A handful of estate lawyers took the back row with legal pads balanced on their knees. The same 2 law students from yesterday sat near the aisle, one already opening a laptop before court had called to order. 2 family observers arrived 10 minutes before the bench, heels sharp on wood, and took seats directly behind Dean, both of them avoiding my eyes with the discipline of people who think detachment can be mistaken for neutrality. The air carried damp wool and copier toner and the metallic chill of old ventilation. Halpin conferred with his associates and passed one of them a blue-backed motion packet. She approached the clerk and asked that it be accepted as supplemental clarification on representational boundaries. I received my copy seconds later. The title read, Motion to Limit Non-Counsel Beneficiary Participation During Evidentiary Authentication. He had stayed up to launder exclusion into process. When the judge took the bench, everyone stood. She sat, scanned the calendar, and called our case with a clipped, efficient cadence that left no room for performance. Halpin rose first and requested leave to argue his supplemental motion before opening exhibits. This is a threshold governance issue, he said. We seek to prevent cumulative prejudice from emotionally invested commentary by a non-fiduciary family participant. He did not say my name until his 3rd sentence. He used beneficiary 4 times and petitioner once. Dean followed with practiced sorrow. Your Honour, this is painful for all of us. We ask only for disciplined administration. My niece has had difficulty separating personal grief from institutional duty. I stood when recognised and kept my hands on the table edge, not the lectern, because posture can answer framing before words do. I oppose, I said. The motion repackages yesterday's denied exclusion request and misstates my noticed role. I am the petitioner on emergency construction and preservation. Instrument language and factual chain are before the court because I placed them there under seal and verified custody through intake last night. I slid my certification copy and evidence verification form to Ms. Liao for bench delivery. No commentary offered, only record. Halpin asked to reply, then pressed harder than he had yesterday, perhaps because the room had more witnesses today and he needed a stronger display. Ms. Brooks may be articulate, but articulation is not qualification. She lacks trustee authority, lacks bar admission, and has a documented emotional proximity that creates reliability concerns. We should not allow her to handle or characterize key evidence without intermediary counsel. One of the junior associates behind him added quietly, forgetting how quiet courtrooms actually are, "This avoids spectacle." The word reached the front row anyway. The judge looked at me over her glasses. "Did you lodge the sealed materials personally?" "Yes," I said, "under Clark's supervision, with chain cards signed by me, Ms. Liao, and intake technician Kessler. Exterior verification recorded on the evidence camera. No seal breach." She turned to Halpin. "Do you contest those facts?" He hesitated just long enough to be seen hesitating. "We contest implications, not the logged steps." The judge made a note and denied the motion from the bench. "Participation will follow caption status and evidentiary rules, not family labels. Counsel will refrain from psychiatric adjectives unless submitting expert basis." That ruling should have settled the morning's first contest. Dean pivoted within minutes as Ms. Leo prepared to call the evidence technician for foundational testimony. Dean leaned toward Halpin and then stood without waiting to be recognized. "Your Honor, one additional concern," he said. "The so-called symbolic pen associated with this file is an heirloom item, not a forensic device. We object to any theatrical treatment of personal effects and request exclusion of non-traditional media as unreliable." He finally looked at me then, direct and deliberate. "My mother kept mementos. That doesn't make them legal instruments." The word theatrical was not an argument. It was social contamination, an attempt to make the room embarrassed for even considering that Evelyn had planned beyond his line of sight. I felt the old pressure in my chest return. Not panic now, but concentrated anger, clean and controlled. I opened my folio, placed the intake supplement and exhibit crosswalk on the table, and said, "No one has requested admission of unexamined media. I request ordinary sequence, establish provenance, verify chain, then seek extraction order if the court deems relevance shown." I let one beat pass before adding, "The object was listed by descriptor in the trust's own associated property schedule, not by me." The judge nodded once, then directed Miss Liao to proceed with foundation witnesses in order. Mr. Kessler was called first. He testified in the language of systems. Barcode scan, seal condition, camera log, no unauthorized access, timed signatures, storage locker number, transfer protocols. He did not dramatize, he did not infer. He simply made improvisation harder. Halpin cross-examined him on handling possibilities and whether a fountain pen could contain a data module without visible indicators. Kessler answered that custom barrel inserts existed and that his role was to preserve condition, not opine on content. Dean sat very still through that exchange, one thumb pressing repeatedly against the edge of his yellow pad until the paper began to crease. 3 days had passed since Evelyn's service, and the family had already fractured into visible camps. Those invested in Dean's certainty, those invested in not choosing, and those waiting to see which side the court would bless so they could call it principle. The legal pressure now carried a social tax. Every objection I raised or declined to raise became material for hallway myth-making by lunch. I could feel that audience pressure as a physical thing in the room. A shallow current of attention moving whenever someone spoke my name with or without title. I chose each sentence as if it would be read back later by someone hostile and someone fair at the same time. At 9:17, with Kessler excused and the bench reviewing the next witness list, the side door opened and the courtroom's sound changed. It was subtle first, the soft scrape of gallery shoes as people turned, the pause in a stenographer's fingers, Halpin's associate stopping mid-whisper, then complete when retired Judge Eleanor Ward entered with a measured pace that made everyone around her accelerate by contrast. She wore a dark suit, cut like a uniform, and carried no briefcase, only a thin folio and her identification wallet clipped inside. Beside her was a woman in hospital administration grey, badge visible at chest level, posture equally composed. Ms. Liao stood before they reached Council Row and confirmed credentials against the witness order. Ward did not scan the gallery for allies. She looked directly to the bench, gave her name for the record, and said, "I am the court-appointed trust protector in the matter of Evelyn Brooks. I request to be sworn immediately due to active interference risk previously reported." The Ombudsman identified herself as Priya Sethi and confirmed she had brought certified access logs and communication records pursuant to yesterday's directive. Dean's pen stopped moving. Several gallery observers shifted forward in their seats for the first time all morning. Ward took the stand under oath and rested one hand lightly on the rail as if she had spent a career in exactly that posture and had no need to prove it. The judge asked whether she had reviewed the sealed exhibit index, the continuity directives, and the emergency communication trail from both hospital admissions. "I have," Ward said. "I also supervised the instrument amendment process 18 months ago in my protector capacity and can authenticate operative intent and enforcement design." Her voice was low, spare, and impossible to interrupt without looking foolish. Halpin tried anyway. "To clarify, Your Honour, intent evidence should not displace plain language." Ward turned to him without turning her shoulders. "Counsel, the plain language is what you have been quoting selectively." A few people in the gallery glanced at one another, then back to the stand. The law student with a laptop stopped typing and simply watched. The judge invited Ward to continue. She did, and in less than 5 minutes she altered the room's centre of gravity. "Section 4.2 is not aspirational," she said. "It is conditional. The loyalty clause incorporates Appendix C definitions by explicit cross-reference and triggers both beneficiary and trustee consequences for documented conduct." She lifted a tabbed copy from her folio. "Loyalty is defined as sustained duty under pressure, adherence to approved care directives, and non-interference with authorised medical access or communication channels. These definitions were drafted after 2 incidents in which informal family pressure disrupted care coordination." She paused, then delivered the sentence that made Dean's shoulders lock. Ms. Natalie Brooks was the sole heir authorised in writing by Evelyn Brooks to execute continuity directives during both incidents. No flourish, no accusation. A factual line placed on the record by the one witness no one could dismiss as sentimental. Halpin stood for cross, throat dry enough that he asked for water before his first question. "Judge Ward, are you suggesting my client interfered with care?" Ward answered, "I am testifying that records reflect attempted rerouting of communications, unauthorised visitor restrictions, and repeated pressure on staff to bypass designated channels. Certified logs will speak for themselves when admitted." She inclined her head towards Sethi, still waiting at the side rail with sealed envelopes. "The Ombudsman's documentation aligns with the Protector file and with notice correspondence sent to this court." Dean rose halfway as if to object personally, then sat when Halpin touched his sleeve. For the first time since this began, Dean looked not angry but uncertain, as if he had reached for an audience reflex and found none. Even the attorneys in the back row had stopped performing detached curiosity. They were now following line by line because the witness on the stand had converted family dispute into institutional breach. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Brooks, do you seek admission of protector authentication at this stage?" I stood. "Yes, Your Honour. Limited purpose, threshold construction and participation authority." "Granted," she said. Then, after a glance at the seating arrangement that had opened the morning, she added, "Ms. Brooks, move to the primary petitioner position for the remainder of this hearing." I moved my folio to the centre chair beneath the card Ms. Liao had written by hand, and for the first time in that brass-trimmed room, no one asked me to move back. I moved my folio to the centre chair beneath the card Ms. Liao had written by hand, and for the first time in that brass-trimmed room, no one asked me to move back. The change was logistical on paper and seismic in practice. From the primary petitioner position, I could place documents directly to the clerk without passing through Dean's counsel, could address the bench without leaning around someone else's shoulder, could meet the witness stand head-on instead of from the margin. The room read that geometry immediately. Status in court is often declared by where your elbows rest. Ms. Sethi was sworn next. She set 2 sealed envelopes on the evidence rail with the care of someone who had handled too many records that arrived after harm instead of before it. Her testimony was concise and methodical. She served as hospital ombudsman for both facilities where Evelyn Brooks had been admitted. She had supervisory access to visitor authorization trails, alert logs, and communication override tickets. She had received the court's preservation directive the previous evening and brought certified extracts with metadata hash summaries attached. When Halpern asked whether she could contextualize family misunderstanding under stress, she answered, "My role is record integrity, not family interpretation." The judge admitted her packet for threshold review over Halpern's relevance objection. The first page displayed a grid of authorized contacts by date, each entry tagged with source and verification method. My name appeared in the designated continuity field on both admissions, with time-stamped updates reflecting physician confirmation and nursing supervisor acknowledgement. Dean's office line appeared repeatedly in attempted override requests marked denied. 2 requests carried notes from staff. Caller demanded immediate routing change. Caller cited family hierarchy not listed in directives. Another log showed an attempted restriction on a pre-approved neighbour visit, reversed by charge nurse after policy review. I had lived those days in real time, but seeing them flattened into institutional entries made the pattern undeniable. Emotion had always made my story easier to dismiss. Timestamps did not care who spoke loudest. Ward requested permission to clarify amendment sequence, and the judge granted it. "For the court's construction analysis," she said, "the loyalty clause and Appendix C were revised together after documented coordination failures. They were drafted to avoid exactly this ambiguity theatre." She turned one tab, then another, each movement unhurried. Section 7.1 extends consequences to fiduciaries who interfere with authorized care and communication pathways. This is not beneficiary etiquette. It is enforceable conduct architecture. Her phrasing carried the weight of someone who had written orders for years and expected them to be followed by people with better suits than judgment. Dean rose for what he framed as a limited response, but he abandoned limitation by his second sentence. "Your Honour, this is being distorted into a compliance trial because my niece has cultivated bureaucratic relationships that exclude the family. My mother was vulnerable. We were all trying to protect her." He gestured toward me without fully turning, as if my name itself were an accusation. "Natalie confuses administrative access with loyalty." He reached for the old contrast, his instinctive authority against my supposed procedural obsession. But Ward had already moved the ground under that tactic by defining loyalty as procedure under pressure. I asked to be heard on remedy scope. The judge nodded. I stood with my notes closed because this part did not require performance. 2 requests, I said. First, immediate denial of any disinheritance interpretation pending full merits because threshold evidence shows active dispute over conduct definitions and fiduciary interference. Second, temporary reassignment of operational trust authority to a neutral compliant channel under protector supervision, with me as executing beneficiary for continuity directives already recognised in writing. I let a breath pass and added one sentence that had waited years for the right room. I am not asking for preference. I am asking for the instrument to be applied as drafted. By 9:34, rain had returned against the high windows, a thin percussive line under the hum of ventilation. The judge reviewed her notes, then asked the question Halpern had tried to prevent all morning. Is there additional evidence within the associated pen container that speaks directly to clause construction? Ward answered first. Yes. A data module placed by Evelyn Brooks containing directive drafts, communication records, and a recorded memorandum defining loyalty criteria in plain language for future disputes. Halpern objected on authenticity and chain grounds. I slid the intake supplement and yesterday's camera verification to Ms. Liao. Kessler was recalled briefly, confirmed no breach since documentation, and identified the same seam indicator he had photographed. The judge authorized limited extraction on the record. The room tightened as Ms. Liao opened the evidence pouch under camera view and passed the pen to Kessler with gloved hands. He unscrewed the barrel in 2 measured turns and released a micro USB insert into a sterile tray. No gasp, no theatre, only the soft click of metal on steel and the scratch of the court reporter's keys accelerating to keep pace. Halpin asked to inspect before playback. Granted. He examined the module, checked the seal sleeve, and returned it with a face that had lost its earlier composure. The clerk's technician loaded the files onto the court terminal while everyone watched the progress bar cross the screen. The memorandum was less than 4 minutes long. Evelyn appeared seated at her writing desk in a cream cardigan, oxygen tubing visible at her cheek, voice thinner than I remembered, and steadier than most people in that room. She stated the date, identified the trust by full legal name, and read her purpose. To define loyalty for any tribunal asked to construe Section 4.2 and Appendix C. Then she spoke in terms no one could sentimentalize. Loyalty is sustained duty when no audience is present. Loyalty is adherence to care directives when outcomes are uncertain. Loyalty is not volume at holidays, not surname leverage, not control over who may speak to me when I am ill. She paused once to sip water, then continued. Any fiduciary who obstructs authorized care access, reroutes communication for private advantage, or pressures staff against directives acts in breach of duty and shall not control discretionary distributions. At the end, she looked directly into the camera and said, If Natalie is the one presenting this, then events have followed the pattern I feared. When the screen went dark, the judge did not speak for several seconds. Silence in court usually means confusion, fatigue, or strategy. This silence was recognition. The evidentiary puzzle Dean had managed by volume for years had snapped into a single line. The instrument said what he claimed it did not say, and the conduct record matched the triggers it described. Halpin requested a sidebar, then converted it to a motion for brief recess when the judge declined side conference. His voice caught once on the word recess, a dry break he could not smooth over. The judge denied recess and ruled from the bench, concise and formal. Threshold findings for emergency administration are as follows. 1. The loyalty clause is conditionally operative and enforceable by incorporated definitions in Appendix C and Section 7.1. 2. Credible preliminary evidence supports material interference by Dean Brooks with authorized care communication channels. 3. Interim disinheritance enforcement against petitioner Natalie Brooks is denied with prejudice to renewal absent contrary merits evidence. 4. Dean Brooks is suspended effective immediately from co-trustee functions pending expedited merits hearing. 5. Temporary controlling fiduciary authority for continuity administration is vested in petitioner Natalie Brooks under supervision of Trust Protector Eleanor Ward. 6. All discretionary distributions are frozen except ordinary care and property preservation expenses. 7. Surcharge exposure for proven interference is preserved. She looked directly at counsel table. This order is not symbolic. It is operational. Compliance begins now. That was the reversal. Brief, public, unmistakable, and written into the same record where he had announced I would never see a penny. Dean stood too quickly, chair legs scraping against wood with a sharp report that bounced off the marble and died. Your Honour, this is extraordinary overreach, he said, but his cadence had lost its practised glide. You are installing a beneficiary who has prosecuted a private grievance into fiduciary control based on curated hospital notes and a staged video. The last phrase weakened him as he spoke it. Staged required intent he could not prove, and everyone in the room knew it. The judge held up one hand. Mr. Brooks, sit down. Further argument through counsel. He did not sit until Halpin touched his sleeve a second time, firmer now. Halpin rose with papers in both hands and none of his morning smoothness. For preservation purposes, he said, then paused to clear his throat. We object to the suspension finding as premature and request immediate stay pending interlocutory review. The judge denied immediate stay. He asked for a narrowed administrative stay limited to signature authority. Denied. He asked for 24 hours before notice dissemination to financial institutions. Granted in part, notices by end of day through clerk portal and protector office. No unilateral communication by suspended fiduciary. Each denial peeled away another layer of Dean's posture. By the third, he had stopped writing altogether. Behind him, a junior associate pressed a folded tissue to her mouth and stared at the bench as if distance could erase the words she had just heard read into public record. One of Dean's associates attempted to pass him a notepad. He waved it away without looking, then reached for his water and missed the glass on the first attempt. The second time he caught it, drank and coughed into his fist hard enough that Halpin paused mid-sentence. No one laughed. No one offered rescue. Audience-dependent authority fails quietly in legal rooms. The collapse is visible in who stops making eye contact first. Miss Liao read the operative order into the record with precise diction, each clause landing like a seal pressed into wax. Suspended, effective immediately. Temporary controlling authority vested. Neutral routing mandatory. Preservation and surcharge reserved. She asked both sides to confirm receipt and understanding. I answered yes. Halpin answered yes. Dean said nothing until the judge instructed him directly, then managed to clipped, understood, without raising his eyes. The law student in the second row resumed typing at speed, trying to catch up with what had just happened. The estate attorneys at the back exchanged the kind of look professionals share when a familiar tactic has failed, in a way that will circulate by afternoon as caution. Ward remained still beside the stand, hands folded, as if this were merely one more correction in a career built on them. Sethi organised her admitted exhibits and requested written confirmation of ongoing non-contact directives for hospital staff. Granted. External contact outcome, resolved on record. Halpin made one final attempt to narrow the reputational damage. Your Honour, we ask that any reference to interference be treated as provisional language only. The judge responded without irritation. All language is as stated in the order. Credible preliminary evidence supporting material interference for interim relief purposes. Merits remain for hearing. Your client may contest there. The distinction was legally proper and socially devastating. It gave him process and took away his myth. Court moved to scheduling. Expedited merits hearing in 10 days. Mandatory production deadlines within 48 hours. Financial institution notices through neutral channel by 5 p.m. Ward designated temporary coordination authority with obligation to file weekly status summaries. I was ordered to submit continuity expense logs and refrain from irreversible asset disposition pending merits. I agreed. Structure, not triumph. The judge closed by reminding all parties that probate is not a stage for family theatre. This court enforces instruments and duties, she said. Act accordingly. When she rose, everyone stood. Dean remained seated half a beat too long, then pushed up with visible effort, face drained of the colour he had carried all morning. In the corridor beyond the glass, people who had waited for other matters pretended not to stare and failed. Halpin leaned in to speak to him, but Dean's response came out uneven, words clipped and too low to pass. He looked toward me once, not with anger now, but with the stunned vacancy of someone hearing his own certainty played back as evidence against him. Then he turned away as Miss Liao handed me the certified interim order, and the room finally organised itself around the record instead of his voice. Then he turned away as Miss Liao handed me the certified interim order, and the room finally organised itself around the record instead of his voice. I did not move until the court reporter had capped her machine and the bailiff had cleared the well, because I had learned that leaving too quickly invites revision. Ms. Liao placed a second packet on top of the order, a custody checklist for admitted exhibits and associated media, and tapped 2 signature lines with her pen. If you want same-day implementation, she said, we do this now, not after lunch. I signed where she indicated, initialed the media handling election, and chose forensic imaging through the court lab with mirrored copies to the Protector and all counsel. No private extraction. No off-record review, no narrative gaps. In the evidence room, 1 floor down, Mr. Kessler set the steel blue binder and the pen case on the stainless counter beneath the same hard task light as the night before. Ward stood at my right, Sethi at my left, both still carrying the composure of people who understood that aftermath is where cases are either secured or quietly weakened. Kessler read each item description aloud, then asked for disposition direction under the new order. Ward answered first. binder. Unseal under camera, inventory contents, then reseal by item in archival sleeves. Pen and module, transfer to lab for image and hash verification. Return originals to vault. He nodded and turned to me. Petitioner concurrence? I said yes. When he broke Evelyn's wax insignia, the sound was almost nothing, a dry, soft crack, but it travelled through me harder than any shouted insult in that marble room. Inside the binder, tabbed sections sat in Evelyn's handwriting, each divider labelled in blue-black ink. Directives, clinical logs, communications, amendments, protector notes. The engraved fountain pen had once looked ornamental in her desk drawer. Now it rested in a numbered evidence cradle beside the tiny module it had protected, both tagged and photographed from 4 angles. Every physical item that had been dismissed as sentiment became, in sequence, indexed material with chain numbers, timestamps, and signatures from people who would testify if needed. Kessler lifted each binder section, announced its tab name, and slid it into clear sleeves while the camera clock ran in the frame corner. At tab 4, Communications, he paused and displayed a printed email string already listed in Sethi's packet. Dean's office requesting direct reroute of physician updates for efficiency and message discipline. Denied by hospital policy, documented twice. Halpern had argued misunderstanding. The language argued control. Ward asked for that page flagged for merits briefing, and Kessler marked it with a red evidence dot. At tab 5, Amendments, we found the executed cross-reference page Halpern had omitted in his late memorandum, with Evelyn's initials at the margin and Ward's protector countersignature beneath. I watched Ward's jaw set by a millimetre, not surprise now, just confirmation. By 12:40 we had signed the unsealing log, the repackage inventory, and the lab transfer form. Kessler sealed the originals in 2 tamper-evident bags and slid them into locker C12, reading the lock code checksum aloud as Miss Liao entered it into the docket addendum. Physical evidence, collected, opened under order, analysed for threshold use, returned to secured storage pending merits. Nothing loose, nothing implied, nothing left in a tote by accident. At 1:15, we were in the clerk's implementation office, a narrow room behind the main desk with 3 monitors, 1 wall clock running 2 minutes fast, and a fluorescent hum that made everyone speak more quietly than they intended. The 5 o'clock notice deadline sat at the top of the order in bold. Ward divided tasks without ceremony. Clerk portal transmits order and authority certificates. Ms. Brooks, you call institutions on speaker with Ms. Liao logging confirmations. Ms. Sethi, hospital non-contact directive renewal and continuity routing. No one argued the plan because hierarchy had finally aligned with competence rather than volume. The first call was to First Commonwealth Private Banking, Trust Operations Desk. A man named Adrian confirmed receipt of the portal transmission, then asked for verbal identity verification from the newly authorised controlling fiduciary. I gave my full name, case number, and the last 4 digits of the trust tax ID. He checked, paused, and said, Authority update accepted. Legacy co-trustee credentials for Dean Brooks are now suspended, pending further court order. Dual control flag is active under protector oversight. Ms. Liao logged the outcome and time to the minute. Second call, Halstead Property Insurance Estate Residence Policy. We require named party adjustment and occupancy designation, the agent said. I read directly from the order language Ward had highlighted. Property preservation expenses authorised, irreversible disposition prohibited, controlling fiduciary vested in petitioner. The agent confirmed interim endorsement issuance by end of day. Third call, utility accounts. Fourth, county tax office. Each response was the same bureaucratic music, verification, hold, updated contact path, and each one cut another thread Dean had used to turn private pressure into institutional fact. At 2:06, my phone lit with Rebecca's name. She had not called me in months unless Dean asked her to. I put it on speaker at Ward's nod. Her voice arrived tight and formal. Natalie, I just saw the order. Dean says this is temporary and that if you keep escalating, we all lose. I felt Ms. Liao's fingers pause above the keyboard. Rebecca, I said, the court set the channels. If you need information, use the portal. A breath, then a sentence she almost finished. I told him after the second hospital week that... She stopped, swallowed, and changed course. Never mind. I don't want to be involved. The line clicked dead. Loaded look, loaded half sentence, no disclosure, and that silence would remain hers, not mine. At 2:19, the junior associate who had whispered, "This avoids spectacle," appeared at the doorway with a service envelope and asked if Miss Liao could stamp receipt. She avoided my eyes until the clerk stepped away, then looked at me directly. "For what it is worth," she said, voice low, "I misread this." It was not a dramatic apology, just a professional correction, late but clean. I nodded once. Noted. She left before I could answer anything kinder, maybe because she understood that accountability does not need comfort to count. By late afternoon, the rain had cleared, and the courthouse glass reflected a hard, pale light across the clerk's counter, where our final confirmations accumulated. At 4:43, the last pending callback arrived from the hospital compliance office. All non-authorized contact attempts were to be routed to legal, staff advisories refreshed, and Evelyn's records access locked to the court-designated list. Sethi gave a brief "thank you" confirmed and ended the call. External contacts completed, logged, outcomes attached. Ms. Liao printed the implementation ledger, 3 copies, each stamped and scanned into the docket before 5 o'clock. Dean did not approach me again. He crossed the lobby once with Halpern and 2 associates, stopped near the revolving doors and looked back in my direction with an expression I could read but no longer needed to decode. Not fury, not remorse, only the disorientation of a man discovering that audience memory can be replaced by institutional memory when someone insists on a record. He started to turn as if to come over, then Halpern said something under his breath and they kept walking. The people who had laughed at his certainty in the morning now watched him leave without speaking. The law student from row 2 passed me at security and gave a small, respectful nod. The one who had looked away yesterday never did speak, and that, too, was an answer. 3 days later, under a clear October sky that made the courthouse stone look almost white, I met Ward on the front steps for the final interim transfer signing. She handed me a slim folder with executed authority certificates, weekly reporting templates, and the lab's preliminary hash verification confirming the module image matched the original extraction with no alteration. "You now have clean control and clean proof," she said. "Use both." I asked one question before we parted. "Did my grandmother believe it would come to this?" Ward considered, then said, "She believed pressure reveals character faster than comfort. She prepared accordingly." That afternoon, I drove to Evelyn's house with a locksmith, a property manager approved through the order, and Miss Ortega from the County Legal Aid Elder Unit. The porch smelled of sun-warmed cedar and old lavender from the planter boxes. Evelyn insisted on trimming herself long after she should have delegated it. Inside, dust motes floated through the hallway light over the same runner rug I had straightened 100 times after pharmacy runs and discharge appointments. We walked room to room with clipboards, documenting condition and needed repairs. Loose railing, bathroom grab bars, smoke detector battery replacements, paint touch-ups. Not sale staging, safety staging. In the dining room, I placed Evelyn's framed photograph at the head of the table and set beside it the engraved fountain pen, now released from evidence by court receipt for secured personal custody after imaging, with a copy of the module archive logged to the trust vault. I did not put it in a display case. I put it in the desk drawer she had used, wrapped in the same linen cloth she preferred, because reverence without utility had never been her style. Ms. Ortega reviewed the occupancy proposal and looked up. "You are certain about legal aid residency use?" she asked. "The waiting list is long. We can place elder abuse clients in transition within a month if permits clear." I signed the memorandum of intent on the dining table, where Dean once said I contributed nothing measurable. At dusk, after they left, I stood alone in the kitchen and listened to the refrigerator cycle on, the ordinary domestic sound that had accompanied years of uncredited duty. I opened my notebook and wrote the final line for the day's log. House retained under court authority for elder aid residence conversion. Fellowship funding authorization drafted in Evelyn Brooks's name for compliance ethics trainees serving protective care systems. Then I closed the notebook and let the quiet settle without asking it to prove anything. My name is Natalie Evelyn Brooks. I did not win because I spoke louder, and I did not heal because the room finally approved of me. I stood in the right forum with clean hands, complete records, and the discipline to let truth travel through structure. Silence was never peace in my family. Silence was the space where I built evidence, and evidence was the language that returned my life to me.